2 weeks. That's how long my neighbor laughed at me before a man with a survey tripod accidentally turned me into the most popular person on our street. Looking back now, the funny thing isn't that he lost over $10,000 because of the fence. The funny thing is how desperately he wanted everyone to believe I was the idiot. My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm 63 years old, retired, and until this happened, I was living a pretty quiet life in a small neighborhood outside Cedar Ridge, Ohio. Nothing fancy, just a modest brick house, a backyard I'd spent nearly 20 years turning into something I actually enjoyed looking at every morning, and a routine so predictable my daughter used a joke that she could set her watch by me. Every morning I'd drink coffee on the patio, feed the birds, trim something that probably didn't need trimming, and wave at whoever happened to be walking their dog. It was peaceful. Then Trevor Collins moved in next door. Now, I don't want to paint Trevor as some cartoon villain. The truth is, guys like Trevor are everywhere. He wasn't mean right away. He was confident. Too confident. The kind of man who always had an answer before hearing the question. If you mentioned your lawnmower broke, Trevor knew a better mower. If you talked about retirement investments, Trevor had already doubled whatever returns he got. If you said the weather felt warm, somehow Trevor knew the exact temperature without checking his phone. Some people found him charming. Others tolerated him. I mostly stayed out of his way. For the first couple years, we had no real problems. We exchanged holiday greetings, borrowed tools once or twice, talked across the driveway, normal neighbor stuff. Then everything changed one Saturday morning when I heard construction equipment outside my kitchen window. I looked over and saw workers unloading cedar fence panels. At first, I didn't think much about it. His old fence was falling apart. Replacing it made sense. But sometime around noon, I walked toward the rear of my yard and noticed something that made me stop. The new fence line looked wrong. Not dramatically wrong, just enough to trigger that little voice in the back of my head that says, "Pay attention." I stood there staring for several minutes. The fence seemed farther inside my side of the property than the original line. I grabbed a tape measure, then measured again. Then again, the numbers didn't make sense. Or maybe they made too much sense. The more I checked, the more uncomfortable I became. By sunset, I was almost certain the fence wasn't sitting on the property line at all. It was sitting inside my yard, a few feet inside. I barely slept that night, not because of the land itself. Honestly, the strip wasn't huge. What bothered me was the principle. For 19 years, I had maintained every inch of that yard. I planted trees there, installed landscape edging, spread mulch every spring, paid taxes on it, watched my daughter play there when she was little. That ground held memories. The next afternoon, I walked over to Trevor's house, carrying a copy of my property documents. I wasn't angry. Not yet. I figured maybe the contractor made a mistake. Maybe Trevor hadn't even noticed. He opened the door holding a beer and smiled. "Hey, Dan, what's up?" I held up the paperwork. "I think your new fence might be over the property line." He looked at the papers, then looked at me, and I swear the smile got bigger. "You think so?" he asked. "Yeah. I measured a few things, and it doesn't look right." He laughed softly, not a nervous laugh, a dismissive laugh, the kind adults use when they think they're talking to a child. "Dan, those contractors build fences every day." "Maybe, but I think somebody should double-check." He took a sip from his bottle. "You worried about 3 feet of dirt?" "It's more than that. Still sounds like dirt to me." I remember standing there feeling something shift. Not anger, disappointment, because I realized this wasn't going to be a simple conversation. I showed him my deed. He barely glanced at it. Then he shrugged and said, "If you got a problem, hire a lawyer." I laughed a little because I thought he was joking. He wasn't. "I'm serious," he said. "The fence is where it's supposed to be." "What about a survey?" I asked. That was when he actually laughed out loud. Full volume. Head tilted back. Like I just delivered the funniest joke he'd heard all week. "Go ahead, Dan. Call a surveyor. Save the rest of us the suspense." Then he closed the door. That should have been the end of it. Except Trevor wasn't satisfied with winning the argument. He wanted an audience. Over the next 2 weeks, he turned it into neighborhood entertainment. Every time people gathered outside, he'd bring it up. I'd be watering plants and hear him across the street telling someone, "Dan thinks I stole his backyard." Then everybody would chuckle. One evening I heard him say, "Maybe he forgot where his property line is." Another time he joked that retirement was affecting my memory. Most people weren't trying to be cruel. They were just hearing one side of the story. But every laugh landed a little harder than the last. What Trevor didn't know was that before retiring, I spent more than 2 decades working in land development consulting. My entire career revolved around property boundaries, plats, easements, engineering reports, and survey documentation. I wasn't guessing. I wasn't eyeballing a fence and making accusations. I understood exactly how property records worked. More importantly, I knew something most homeowners forget. Paperwork matters. A lot. That following weekend, I went into my basement and opened a fireproof filing cabinet I'd owned since the 90s. Inside were folders documenting nearly every major event connected to my house. Closing records, compte plots, utility maps, original surveys, inspection reports, everything. My daughter used to tease me for keeping all of it. That night, sitting at a folding table under a fluorescent light, I spread the documents across the surface and started reviewing them one by one. And the more I looked, the more confident I became. Trevor wasn't a little wrong. He was very wrong. The question was whether I was willing to prove it. By midnight, I'd made my decision. Monday morning, I called a licensed surveying company. And that's when the real story began. The woman who answered the phone at the surveying company sounded like she'd handled 1,000 property disputes before mine. She asked a few questions, took down my address, and scheduled a field crew for the following Tuesday. The whole call lasted maybe 10 minutes, but when I hung up, I felt calmer than I had in weeks. Not because I knew what the outcome would be, but because I knew facts were finally entering a situation that had been fueled almost entirely by ego. Meanwhile, Trevor was still enjoying his little victory tour around the neighborhood. Every few days, I'd catch pieces of conversations floating across driveways. Sometimes he was telling people I was trying to claim part of his yard. Other times he joked that I was preparing some grand legal battle over a few blades of grass. One afternoon, I was checking my mailbox when our neighbor Linda approached me carefully, almost like she was walking into a minefield. "Dan, can I ask you something?" she said. "Sure. Are you really fighting Trevor over the fence?" I smiled. "I'm not fighting anybody. I'm waiting for a survey." She looked relieved. "That's what I thought. The way he's telling the story makes it sound like you're ready to go to war." I laughed. "Trust me, if I wanted a war, I'd have started one already." She laughed too, but after she walked away, I found myself thinking about something. Trevor wasn't defending himself. He was campaigning. He wanted the neighborhood on his side before any evidence showed up. People only do that when they're either deeply insecure or deeply convinced they're untouchable. At the time, I wasn't sure which one applied to him. Tuesday morning arrived with clear skies and cool air. Around 8 o'clock, a white survey truck rolled onto the street. Then a second vehicle pulled in behind it. 3 surveyors stepped out carrying equipment cases, tripods, measuring rods, and enough technology to make a small military operation jealous. I walked outside to greet them. The crew chief introduced himself as Mark. He looked to be in his 50s, sunburned from years of field work, with the kind of calm confidence that comes from being right for a living. We reviewed the documents I provided, and then they got to work. Almost immediately, the neighborhood noticed. Garage doors opened. Curtains moved. Dog walkers suddenly developed reasons to linger nearby. By 9 o'clock, half the street seemed aware something was happening. Trevor came outside around then. He crossed his arms and watched from his driveway. At first, he looked amused. When Mark's crew began establishing reference points near the curb, Trevor shouted across the yard, "Hope you're getting your money's worth, Dan." I simply nodded. Mark glanced at me. "Neighbor," he asked quietly. "Something like that," I said. He grinned and went back to work. The survey process wasn't dramatic. That's the funny thing people don't understand. Truth usually isn't dramatic. It's methodical, boring even. The crew spent hours taking measurements, checking county records, locating monuments, verifying coordinates, and comparing everything against historical plats. No arguments, no speeches, just professionals doing their jobs. Around 10:30, I noticed Trevor wasn't smiling as much anymore. He kept walking closer to the work area. Not close enough to interfere, but close enough to listen. Every time the surveyors discussed a measurement, his attention sharpened. Around noon, Mark and one of the technicians began searching near the rear corner of my lot. A few minutes later, I heard one of them call out, "Found it." They had located an original iron pin buried beneath years of soil and grass growth. That was a significant moment. Original boundary markers don't care about opinions. They don't care who tells the best story at neighborhood barbecues. They simply exist where they were placed decades earlier. Trevor's expression changed noticeably after that discovery. For the first time all day, he stopped making comments. By early afternoon, several neighbors had gathered at a distance. Nobody wanted to admit they were watching, but everyone was watching. Human nature is funny that way. Give people a property dispute, and they'll treat it like the Super Bowl. Around 2 o'clock, Mark approached me holding a clipboard. I could tell by his face that the calculations were finished. Before he said a word, he looked toward Trevor's fence. Then he looked back at me. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "we've completed verification against all available records." My stomach tightened, not because I thought I was wrong, but because certainty always feels different from suspicion. Then he delivered the sentence that changed everything. "That fence is 4 feet, 3 inches inside your property boundary." For a moment, everything became strangely quiet. I glanced toward Trevor. His face had gone completely blank. Not angry, not embarrassed, just stunned. Mark continued explaining measurements, legal descriptions, and documentation procedures, but honestly, I barely heard him. I was watching Trevor. For 2 weeks, he'd acted like I was a confused old man. For 2 weeks, he'd told people I didn't understand my own property. And now, 3 licensed professionals had just confirmed exactly what I'd been saying from the beginning. Trevor finally walked over. "That can't be right," he said. Mark remained polite. "We've checked every reference point multiple times." "Check again." "We already did. Maybe the county records are wrong." Mark actually smiled at that one. Not a mocking smile. More like the smile a math teacher gives when someone argues that 2 plus 2 equals 5. "The records are consistent with the monuments and the subdivision filing," he explained. "The boundary location is clear." Trevor looked at me. I could see frustration boiling beneath the surface. What he wanted was an argument. What he got was documentation. Those are very different opponents. Over the next several days, the formal report was finalized and submitted. I didn't celebrate. I didn't walk around saying I told you so. Honestly, I mostly felt tired. The whole situation had consumed more mental energy than I wanted to admit. But the story wasn't over yet, because proving the fence was misplaced turned out to be the easy part. Getting Trevor to accept reality was much harder. A week later, he knocked on my door. When I opened it, he was holding a copy of the survey report. "This is ridiculous," he said. "Maybe we can work something out." That phrase immediately caught my attention. Work something out. Funny how quickly people start negotiating once facts stop supporting them. "What exactly do you mean?" I asked. He shifted uncomfortably. "Maybe I keep the fence where it is and pay you something." I almost laughed. Not because the offer was insulting, but because of how dramatically his position had changed. 2 weeks earlier, he claimed the land was his. Now he wanted to rent it from me. "No," I said. "The fence needs to be moved." His jaw tightened. "You're really going to make me tear the whole thing out?" I looked directly at him. "Trevor, I didn't build it in the wrong place." For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he turned and walked away. That conversation ended whatever chance remained for an easy resolution. A few days later, the county became involved. The official encroachment complaint moved through the system faster than I expected. Apparently, local governments take unauthorized structures crossing property lines pretty seriously. Within 10 days, Trevor received formal notice requiring corrective action. Remove the fence. Remove the concrete footings. Restore the disturbed ground. Return the property to its original condition. The document was thorough, detailed, and completely non-negotiable. That's when the reality of the situation finally landed on him. Because until then, the dispute had existed mostly in conversation. Now it existed on government letterhead. And government letterhead has a way of making things feel very real. About a week later, construction trucks returned to his property. Only this time, they weren't there to build something. They were there to undo a very expensive mistake. I'll never forget the sound of that fence coming down. Not because it was loud, but because of what it represented. Less than a month earlier, Those cedar panels had gone up like a monument to certainty. Trevor stood in his yard watching the installation with his chest puffed out, acting like he'd settled the matter forever. Now the same panels were being stacked onto a trailer one section at a time, while crews chipped away concrete footings that never should have been poured there in the first place. I watched part of the removal from my patio with a cup of coffee in my hand. Not a spite. At least I don't think it was spite. Maybe it was closure. Maybe after weeks of being treated like the neighborhood fool, I simply needed to see reality reassemble itself. A few neighbors wandered by throughout the day. Some stopped to chat. Others just observed quietly. What struck me most was how different the conversation sounded now. The laughter was gone. The jokes were gone. Suddenly everyone was talking about surveys, permits, county records, and property law. Funny how facts changed the tone of a room. Linda walked over at one point and sat beside me for a few minutes. "You handled this better than I would have," she admitted. I smiled. "You say that now." She shook her head. "No, really. If somebody spent 2 weeks making me look crazy, I'd probably never let them forget it." I laughed. Trust me, I thought about it. And that was true. There were plenty of moments when I imagined marching over there with copies of the survey report and reading every line out loud. There were moments when I wanted Trevor to feel exactly what I'd felt standing alone while people questioned my judgment. But age teaches you something important. Vindication feels good for about 5 minutes. Peace lasts a lot longer. By the end of the second day, most of the fence was gone. By the end of the week, every post had been removed, the damaged soil had been restored, and the property line sat exactly where it had always been. The final cost, according to what several neighbors later told me, ended up somewhere north of $10,000 once labor, demolition, materials, permits, and restoration work were added together. All because one man decided confidence was a substitute for verification. The strange part is that Trevor and I barely spoke after that. There was no dramatic apology. No emotional reconciliation. No movie ending where he walked across the yard and admitted I was right. Real life rarely works that way. For several months, we simply existed next to each other. A polite nod here, a quick wave there, nothing more. Then one evening near the end of summer, I was trimming hedges near the driveway when Trevor approached unexpectedly. He looked different somehow, less certain, less loud. He stood there awkwardly for a few seconds before speaking. "I should have checked before building it," he said. It wasn't much. 12 words. No grand speech. No excuses. But it was probably the most honest thing I'd ever heard him say. I set down my hedge trimmers. "Yeah," I replied. "Probably." He gave a small nod. Then he walked back home. That was the entire conversation. Yet somehow it felt bigger than all the arguments that came before it. Because for the first time, neither of us was trying to win. We were simply acknowledging what happened. Looking back now, the fence was never really the issue. For feet of land didn't change my life. What bothered me was something deeper. It was being dismissed. Being told I didn't understand something I understood perfectly well. Being laughed at before anyone bothered checking the facts. I think that's why this story resonates with so many people. Most of us have experienced some version of it. Maybe not over property lines. Maybe not over fences. But we've all had moments when someone with a loud voice assumed they were right and expected everyone else to accept it. Sometimes those people get away with it. Sometimes they don't. In this case, the truth happened to arrive carrying tripods, measuring rods, and county records. And the truth didn't care who laughed the hardest. The truth didn't care who won the popularity contest. It only cared where the line actually was. Every now and then, people still ask me about the dispute. Usually new neighbors who've heard pieces of the story. They always want to know if I enjoyed being proven right. The honest answer is yes, a little. I'd be lying if I said otherwise. Watching that survey crew confirm everything I've been saying was incredibly satisfying. But what I remember most isn't the victory. It's the lesson. Keep your records. Know your facts. Stay calm when people try to provoke you. And never confuse confidence with evidence. Because confidence can build a fence in the wrong place. Evidence can tear it right back down. As for Trevor, we've settled into something resembling neighborly peace. We aren't friends. Probably never will be. But we're civil. Maybe that's enough. Maybe that's how most real-world conflicts end. Not with dramatic revenge, but with boundaries clearly marked and lessons quietly learned. Still, every time I walk through that section of yard and see the restored grass growing where the fence once stood, I can't help smiling a little. Not because I beat somebody, because I trusted the facts when everyone else trusted the noise. And honestly, I make that choice again every single time. Now I'm curious what you think. If you were in my position, would you have handled it the same way? Or would you have taken Trevor to court and pushed for even more damages after everything he said and did? Let me know down in the comments. And if you've ever dealt with a neighbor dispute, a property line argument, or someone who was absolutely convinced they were right until the evidence proved otherwise, share your story below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because some of the most unbelievable stories are the ones that actually happened right next door.